So this is where I'm like, okay, this is going to be completely masked, and the system may incentivize the mental health struggles itself. This is why now I'm walking around these corporate environments loudly telling my stories of depression and anxiety. Because if no one shows up different, then there's nothing to model off of to represent a different way of us showing up.
Hey, gang. Welcome back to another week here with Drew and Alex on Mops and Mo's. We were just before hitting record having a conversation about would you rather. It was a would you rather
It was a would you
conversation.
rather. It's a tough one. I honestly, when I first stumbled across this would you rather question, thought that guys would be more likely to have a strong opinion on this one than women. But I have received several strong opinions from women on this one too. So who knows? The choice is between you have both before you and you get to choose only one. The perfect stick, that can be whatever your vision of a perfect stick is, or the perfect rock, whatever your version of a perfect rock is. Everybody's wandered in the woods, found a great stick before. You got to decide whether you're bringing that stick home with you. Everybody's like been by the lake and found a really cool rock. Obviously, add it to the collection. Drew, which are you choosing, the perfect stick or the perfect rock?
It's funny you mentioned woods and lakes because I live on a lake next to the woods and I've been walking with a 3-year-old who picks up
Hmm.
every stick and every rock. And I'm now trying to think. It's hard because it's very contextual. Like a really, because the picture you posted, the perfect rock was like a spherical kind of flat.
Hmm.
And I'm thinking if the goal is to skip a rock,
Hmm.
that's pretty enticing. Because a perfect stick, I mean, if you get to like smack somebody with it, I guess it's kind of cool. I don't know. I think I'm gonna say rock. I'll probably say rock.
You're gonna say rock?
I think so, yeah.
It's a classic that we're splitting sides on this one. I think for me
Stick.
at least, people have different experiences, and like you said, it's very contextual. But if I just had to pick, regardless of context, all other things being equal, there's more like pure happiness and enjoyment from a really, really good stick than there is from a really good rock.
Yeah, and we're flirting with dangerous territory here, but I do have a question for you, which would be what is your perfect stick?
Maybe this makes me a nerd. The perfect stick is one that looks like a wizard staff, like a perfect walking stick, about person height. Ideally, and this is and now we're in territory like this is breaking the rules of the whole thing, but a truly perfect stick would have a place at the top of it where you could like wedge a cool rock into it, preferably a crystal of some kind.
Well, here's a shameless plug for the thing I sent you on Instagram the other day. If you guys have not seen this Instagram account, official stick reviews,
It's good.
I think Scenic Pisses is one of my favorite Instagram accounts.
Also very good. I discovered that because of you.
Official stick reviews might be like a close second, if not a top
I will
tier.
say the specific stick review you sent me was better than most of their other content. Like
Well,
that
it's
was a
all user
highlight for
submitted.
real.
It's all
Yeah,
user
for
submitted,
sure.
and it's
But the one you sent
hilarious.
me was incredible, and not all of their content quite lives up to that level of
Yeah.
perfection.
So if you guys want to waste some time today, those two accounts, Scenic Pisses and
It's exactly what it sounds like.
official stick reviews. And I will tell you the beauty of both of those accounts is in the content, but it's equally in the comment section. So
The good stuff's always in the comments.
always in the comments. However, though, with that being said, Alex, who are we talking to today?
We, first of all, have been struggling with transitions from banter to introductions.
I think we just own it at this point.
We've had some good ones like weeks in the past. These last few have been rough, man. We're gonna have to get that together. We are welcoming back for the third time, making him the most frequent guest on Mops and Mo's, Newton Cheng, Google's Director of
Here
Health
you
and
go.
Performance.
Newton rocks. There you go.
Ooh, there it is. There's a
Okay.
transition. Thought of that a little bit too late. We've had an ongoing conversation with Newton. It kind of started around the concept of what can military human performance learn from corporate wellness, and what can corporate wellness learn from military human performance. And that's what most of our conversations kind of center around. But this latest conversation with Newton was spurred by Newton's recent success with two particular efforts he's been working on. First, he's kind of cracked the code on communicating about health and wellness with younger generations, something that the military struggles with, both in recruiting and after people are in uniform, and frankly, something I struggle with trying to figure out what content resonates with people. And second, he has found a way to make conversations around mental health engaging in a social media context. He's done really well with this. And once again, this is an area that the military knows it has a problem, but has struggled to find solutions. So we're going to talk to Newton a little bit about how he makes those conversations engaging and compelling.
Yeah, and you mentioned this is his third time coming on. Certainly, I would hazard a guess to say not his last. And I know we don't number our episodes, but I would encourage folks, if you do enjoy this episode, to go back and listen to the previous two. Though don't
Link in
feel
the
like
show notes.
link in the show notes. Though don't feel like you need to listen to them prior to listening to this one. But yeah, every time we chat with Newton, it's always a pleasure. I mean, it's still the whole conversation around Google's human performance program is a fascinating one to me. And we really even at this point haven't yet gotten into the weeds of what that truly looks like. So yeah, these conversations are fun.
Newton's a good one. Enjoy. I've heard a huge number of conversations, like the closed door at the Army schools conversations of like senior leaders bemoaning that they like don't know how to talk to their young soldiers now.
But I mean, hasn't that been going on for
Yeah, for sure. It's not
forever?
new, but that's definitely something that's like in the dialogue all the time lately.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting. Like, so we came together to talk about social media, and at some point on Instagram, I decided to dive in due to powerlifting,
Mhm.
and both powerlifting as well as Instagram, they skew young. So you end up in conversation with a bunch of young people, whether you plan to or not. And then once you're there, you get a lot of practice talking to young people. Like, I understand what the 100 emoji means now. Like, I had no idea. It's like, why is everyone putting 100 after statements?
Or cap. What is it? Cap and no cap?
Yeah.
Wait, what's cap?
I think cap. Alex, you're the youngest one here. What does cap mean?
Cap means it's not true. No cap means like facts.
Ah, yes. Yeah, someone asked if I was capping on a post of mine. I said no.
Happen on a post. So would that mean that it's not true?
They asked if he was lying. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I like how confident you are in this, Alex. This is scary.
But what I see is like I'm not even that old. I'm 45, but it's kind of like learning a new culture. You got to go in there, you got to practice the language to just be able to communicate, and then at some point you can start influencing one another.
Mhm.
And if I see the older generation is just they're a lot of them are honestly just afraid to use things like an Instagram. The generations are just not meeting. I'm like, if you're not meeting there, I know you're not meeting in real life. So where are we talking to one another, if anywhere?
Hmm.
It brings up something I was wondering about. You already mentioned that you got into the social media thing around powerlifting, but your platform has evolved pretty dramatically from just a powerlifting thing. The the themes I see on there, the two obvious ones are competitive powerlifting and then mental health stuff. But there's kind of a third one of just navigating careers and executive leadership and things like that. And I just kind of want to know what thread connects those topics. Like what's the driving force behind all this?
So the powerlifting it's kind of a anachronism. I'm like, well, it started off as a powerlifting page, and I never stopped powerlifting, so it's still there. Even though if I took that away, I think I'd keep most of my audience at this point. Like, the powerlifters would be pissed, but honestly, like, as much as the sport has grown, I'm like, no one cares about us. Like, let's be real.
Oh man,
So
we got a big portion of our audience who will be bothered by that
No,
statement.
I mean he's right.
He's not wrong.
yeah, I mean, this coming from a guy who, like, I am waking up before my kids get up so that I can squat because I love it so much. And I have also accepted the reality that no one gives a shit.
You've probably helped guide more powerlifters towards accepting like therapy, which is good.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think for some of them, they go to powerlifting in lieu of therapy.
That's probably
At a
true
minimum,
too.
I hope they're doing both now.
Yeah, that's fair.
But back to the page. So if we put powerlifting aside as like that was just the starting point. I think it was around last December. I posted a reel where it was just a selfie video of me walking into work at 4:30 a.m. And I said, I'm getting into work at 4:30 a.m. and it's not because I'm super dedicated as an employee, it's because I didn't plan well. And I just felt like posting that. At this time I had about 1,500 followers, mostly from powerlifting. And suddenly it's got like 10,000 views. Like, okay, well, that's unusual. So then I go throughout my day and I go back and it's got like 100,000 views. Like, okay, that's really unusual. I thought, I started posting my stories like, okay, who shared this on their stories? Like, was it Oprah? Was it Taylor Swift? Was it The Rock? I actually ran a poll, and the one who won the poll was Goku, who is, if you guys know your Dragon Ball,
Dragon Ball Z.
isn't it? Yeah, so the fictional character Goku, that's the best theory my followers came up with as to who reposted this reel and why it blew up. As of today, I think that reel's got like 2.6 million views.
Wow. You said it was a year ago?
But what it did was it brought this was last December, so a few months ago.
Okay.
And so I just started asking people, like, hey, why do you like this? Like, I'm just like some dude walking into work. And it was two things. It was like highly relatable, and it was vulnerable in a really authentic way, or at least that's the way a lot of people perceived it. And so I'm like, okay, so you feel like you were lacking this. And so then I started trying an experiment where I thought, like, okay, who's on this platform? And I looked at my following. It's about 60% men between the age of largely 18 to 35. It's about 40% women, and it's a more even distribution across ages, all the way up to, age ranges up to 65, say. And so I decided, like, okay, let's say the bulk is young men. What are the things that I wish that someone had told me back when I was 20 that no one was going to say out loud because it was embarrassing or we thought it was shameful? But now that I'm older, I'm like, dude, of course you felt that way. Like, no one has things figured out when they're 20. So I just started telling vulnerable stories about things I screwed up in my 20s, times I felt lost, all the times where I thought I was supposed to have it figured out and I didn't. And a lot of my reels just started blowing up. So, now they get before that, they'd get maybe, I don't know, 1 to 2,000 plays. Now entry levels like about 10,000, and they go all the way up to like 1 to 2 million. And between December and now, my following has grown from 1,500 to we're approaching 25,000. And all I'm doing is just telling these stories about times where I felt struggle, and saying, well, here's what I've learned since, and that's it.
Why do you think, and admittedly, I haven't fleshed this question out as I'm asking it, but I've seen that theme resonate, or I guess repeat itself quite a bit, which is that somebody becomes vulnerable, somebody starts to tell like their truth, and people swarm to it because they see themselves in some of that. But there's still this kind of resistance or hesitancy to raise your hand and say, yeah, I'm going through the same thing. Like I guess what I'm getting at here is like, having listened to you speak about this before and listened to some of the other podcasts you've been on, you get applauded for being that vulnerable and being that authentic. And I'm just curious as to why we still think that that is such an admirable thing to do as opposed to just normalizing it, if that makes sense.
So I have a working hypothesis around this. I used to think it was just, I'm a little older, I can speak from a place of experience, and I would claim I am an incrementally better writer than most people on Instagram.
Probably fair.
But yeah, I don't mean to sound egotistical, but I don't think the bar is that high.
100%. Cap. No cap. Cap? I don't remember.
But then I recently listened to this book called The Status Game by a guy named Will Storr, where it looks through various events in history through the lens of status, and it makes the assertion that having status is a core human need,
Mhm.
and therefore people are always trying to figure out, for the system I'm in, how am I accumulating status? Is my status going up or down? And other people are queuing off the people who are higher status. And so it's very akin to, there's a book called Wanting by Luke Burgess about mimetic desire and how
Mm.
we are a mimicking species. So we mimic those who are seen as higher status, higher power within whatever system we see ourselves in. And so if I look through it at that lens, I'm like, I try to come across as like, I'm just some dude. I'm just some dude who's older than you. But there are a bunch of signals there too of like status, where it's like, yeah, I'm older. I seem to be on paper successful and working at this place called Google. I have all these powerlifting championships. I have a loving family, and I checked all the life stage boxes that, say, a 20-year-old would probably like to check in the next 20 years. So if I look through it as status lens, it's like, okay, person with status is kind of traveling back through time to tell me they are just like me and it's okay for me to struggle. And so it's like, yes, the words resonate, but they also come with built-in power to them.
There's a lot of directions I kind of want to go from this, but before we do that, I'd like to back up a little bit because we've had you on here. This is now the third time. I don't think we may have done it in the first one. I'm not sure if we've actually given you the chance to explain kind of your story and what got you into like the sharing your message around mental health stuff. And I've heard you tell it plenty of times, but I bet a lot of our audience hasn't. Can you just just a quick intro to what happened that got you to this point of deciding to share your story?
Yeah, let me think about where to start this story. Like I've been through too many public speaking trainings now where they make me start with the hook, and that would just be awkward right now.
There I was. No cap.
Yes, there will be no cap in during this story. So I think I'll go back to I guess it would have been March 2020, which was the beginning of the pandemic. And so if you remember back then, everything kind of just shuts down, at least in the US. It was starting to shut down earlier in other parts of the world. In the US, it was in March 2020, things really started to shut down. So everyone gets sent home. We're all living under fear of this new thing called COVID, and we don't know much about it. We just know a lot of people are going to the hospital, and it seems easily transmissible. And so we're all living under this cloak of fear. Like, am I in danger? Is my family in danger? And so at Google, they sent us all home. And so suddenly we're all working from home. But at the same time, we're all trying to lean in and do the right thing. And so I was taught that when we're in a time of crisis like this is when you really lean in, like you do what needs to be done. And so my organization and me, we took on more work across the company as we could. And it felt like the right thing to do. Like, we spent more time checking in with people. We delivered health and well-being services digitally to their homes. And it really felt right, but it was completely exhausting. So by about the summer, that's when these red flags started to appear, where I think I had just been holding the brave smile for a few months. And we're doing a check-in on Google Meet, and we're going around the thumbnails just asking the question, how are you doing? And right before it gets to me, one of my friends sends me a chat and says, I feel like people aren't saying anything real. Like, can you say something real? And so I'm like, okay, what's real for me? And it gets to me. And the first thing that comes to mind that's real for me is I start tearing up. And I say, right now, I'm struggling because the number of days that I'm proud of how I'm showing up as a father is going down. And I don't know how to turn that around. And so up until this point, I'd been killing it at work. I was getting just increasingly stressed out and terse at home. We had lost childcare, and there were just more and more incidents where I might snap at my daughter or ignore my daughter, or just not be the type of dad that I knew she deserved. And so you do that enough times and you start feeling like a real piece of shit. So after that meeting, a lot of people checked in on me and they, said, "How are you doing? Are you okay?" And I sucked it up and I'm like, "It's fine. I'm working on it." By that fall, I took on some additional work and that have essentially doubled my workload. By November, that's when I first started to struggle to get out of bed in the morning. And then February was the first time there was a morning where I physically couldn't get out of bed because I was paralyzed with a sense of dread. Soon after that, I started going to the employee assistance provider because I knew something was really wrong. And the therapist they provided told me that I was showing early signs of burnout. By the fall, I was seeing a different therapist, and he said, "You are showing major symptoms of depression and anxiety." And I was like, "What are you talking about? Like, isn't this just what it's like to work hard?" And he said, "Well, yes, but you answered yes to all these things on this assessment, which was the PHQ-9." And he said, "These show you are exhibiting major symptoms of depression and anxiety." And then the aha for me, it's kind of like I didn't, it was almost like I left my body. I heard these words coming out of my mouth. I said, "But what are you talking about? I've been feeling this way off and on since high school." And so that was like the big aha for me of like, okay, I thought this was stress of the pandemic. I thought this was stress of parenting. I didn't even have basic awareness. Like if someone asked, "Are you depressed?" I'd say, "Of course not." And then if they had asked, "Do you know what that feels like?" I'd say, "I don't know. Like, do you just start crying and you hide, or I have no idea." And it's like, "No, it's that thing I've been feeling off and on since high school." So that was my aha. Now, the next thing that happened was I was scheduled to give a keynote at a Google Health and Wellbeing conference. And knowing that I was struggling like this, instead of getting up and talking about the amazing intersections of Google technology and health and well-being, I knew I had to throw that out. And instead, I got up and I told the audience what was really going on, which is that I had long been struggling with depression and anxiety, and I'd soon be going out on mental health leave. And if we were going to say, "Hey, we're leaders of this industry of health and well-being," then that was the most important thing that we needed to talk about because we all knew the data. We knew how many were struggling. So a few months later, I went on mental health leave. I came back in May 2022 in a much better place, and with much better tools around managing my mental health. And I committed to telling my mental health story anywhere I was invited to do so for the next 12 months at least. That was almost 2 years ago now. And I have speaking engagements until the end of 2024. And I spend about an hour a week sourcing leads at most because there's this amazing hunger to have these conversations out in the open because so many are struggling, so many are hiding it due to stigma, and we can't solve a problem if we can't talk about it. So here I am again. Thank you for giving me space to tell my story one more time. And hopefully that's going to help someone who hears it.
I'm glad that so I know you mentioned speaking engagements, and I heard you literally today. I was listening to another podcast that you were on, and you told the same story. And I was so happy to hear you hit the same landmarks because all these questions came to mind for me, thinking specifically about the military, but even more specifically about this kind of human performance niche within the military. And what I would highlight within that is the need for conversations around the human element, which I know we've talked to you about before since you've been on here. But what stuck out to me in your story was that you were there to give a keynote on what, for all intents and purposes, was going to just be more of a self-licking ice cream cone, pat on the back, look at all the great things Google's doing. And you elected to actually have a real conversation about, hey guys, no shit, like this is the important thing. And I guess what I'm trying to tease out from you is like, since you've been doing this now for a while, is there a lesson or a series of lessons to be learned there for organizations? Because what I tend to see is you go to these symposiums, you go to these conferences, you go to these big events, and it's just the same shit over and over again. Let me tell you all the great things I'm doing. Let me tell you that. And then after the thing's over, you're in the hallway with these people or you're at lunch, and like it's the complete opposite of what they just told you in their presentation. And so I'm curious what you've teased out from that. Like, how can you create more organizational vulnerability so that people are able to actually talk about the things and then, move forward with that initiative versus here's another cool project I'm working on?
Yeah, I have several thoughts, and then I kind of want to turn this back on you guys because I think my thoughts probably apply to a Google or similarly progressive companies. But then if I think about how would you do this in somewhere that's more culturally like the military, I'm not exactly sure.
Mm.
So one of the things that I give a few tips, and my assumption is I'm talking to a leader of a team or of an organization. So the overall advice, like if you just go to your Brene Brown cheat sheet, is um, if no one knows who Brene Brown is, go read her book Dare to Lead. And if you actually just read it and did the stuff in there, and all the leaders in your organization did the stuff in there, like you probably have 80% of this problem solved. It's really good stuff, but change takes time, and there's a whole cultural element that keeps that people from adopting some of those practices. But let's put that aside for a second. So the way I start is if you're a leader, you're being asked to show up more open and vulnerable around the topic of mental health. So the pushback I always get there is like, but I don't struggle with mental health. Like, I haven't been diagnosed with depression or anxiety. And like, maybe that's true. Maybe you're not aware, but it's not my place to try to needle you until you admit that you struggle with mental health. That's not the goal here. So instead, what I say is we're not talking about mental health. So what I've learned, say via Instagram, is people just want to know you struggle like a real human, just like them. So I give them the acronym FUD, which comes actually from the PR world for smear campaigns. It means fear, uncertainty, and doubt. But we're not going to apply it to a smear campaign. We're going to apply it to telling vulnerable stories. Tell me about a time you felt fear. Tell me about a time you felt uncertainty, or tell me about a time you felt doubt. And if you can check one of those boxes, you're going to start to reveal some of the struggles that you've been through, not just the facts of what happened, but how you felt. Now, if for whatever reason you can't go there, like you're just not comfortable, this is like the easy escape from that still moves the ball forward. Tell people I understand that in order for our culture to move forward, I need to show up as more open and vulnerable around struggle. I'm not ready to do that. And that act in and of itself is an act of vulnerability. It's the lowest we can get the bar, but it will still work to change the temperature in the room. Now, if you go there, here's what you need to do next. You're like, okay, I couldn't do it myself. You are the one with status and credibility, though, in terms of authority. You need to license that out to other people in your organization. You could say, I'm not ready to go there yet. But you know who's doing a really good job of showing up as this type of leader is Drew. So I want you to go like watch this talk that Drew did. Go talk to Drew on these topics. Talk to Drew about how he leads his team through things like struggle and mental health. And so if you can get every leader at least doing one of those things, then you can start to change the culture and norms in the system. And all of those things should be achievable. But change takes time, and it's got to be consistent across a populace.
Mhm.
I see what you're thinking.
Well, I'm sitting here because you prefaced all of that by turning it around a little bit, and I know this is something Alex and I banter about all the time. It's just kind of like, and we mentioned before recording, like there's a lot of goodness to the structure of the military, but particular topic is I find incredibly interesting because it forces the military as a whole to kind of look at itself in the mirror and say, okay, if we truly do want to put people first and live by all of these maxims, people over machines and blah 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 blah. It's like it's going to require some hard conversations and quite frankly a restructuring of the entire system. And I think about this in my position as a leader and the active duty soldiers that work under me. And you are not, Alex, you may want to correct me on this, but like in the military, you are not rewarded for being a person. You are rewarded for being a robot. And the more robotic you are, the more boxes you check, the higher you climb. If you are vulnerable and open and honest and approachable, maybe a bridge too far. I think that there's some really good leaders who are very approachable, but the more human you become, the harder it is to objectively climb the ladder against your peers, because that's ultimately what you do in this world. Um, I don't know if I may have totally missed the mark, Alex, but what are your thoughts?
Now that you have me thinking about one of the best leaders I worked for in the Army, and I'm not going to name him because this story gets a little bit political potentially. But as you as you get more senior in rank in the military, you end up in situations where the person who decides your fate professionally, which is essentially your senior rater. So your boss's boss is going to like ultimately check the box at the bottom of your performance evaluation that determines whether you're going to go far and do great things. By the time you're a battalion commander, so like a lieutenant colonel commanding 700-ish people, your boss's boss is the division commander. A couple stars in his shoulder, got a lot of things going on. You'll communicate with them, but like actually interacting with them in a human way probably only happens a couple times a year. Maybe a little bit more than that if you count big meetings and things like that. And what that creates is a situation where all the incentives are stacked so that leaders need to show their senior leaders like a perfect image of what's going on in their organization. Like they have everything under control. There are no problems under them. They have all the resources they need and they're off to accomplish the mission. And not only that, they want to take on more, harder, bigger missions. And that's never true. Like never in the military does an organization have all the resources it could possibly need and no problems in it. You just have to portray that face to senior leadership. Because if you become, you may have a problem that you need your leadership's help with, but if you become that subordinate commander who always needs help, that doesn't bode well for your evaluation down the road necessarily. So bringing awareness to issues that are outside your control to solve, you have to know you're taking a risk when you do that. And it gets personal because the commander I worked for when I was a lieutenant, you could see him make the choice to put the people under his command higher on his list of priorities than the people above him in the chain of command. And that was a huge risk for him professionally. Things have worked out pretty well for him. He's gone on with his career. He didn't get the exact thing he wanted as the next step and things like that, but I think things are working very well. So it restored my faith in the way the system works. but it was like realizing that was happening real time was a scary thing to watch, to like understand that dynamic of an organization.
How does that work at Google? I mean, I would imagine that you're being applauded for the work that you're doing now.
Well, it's interesting. Like I am being applauded, but if you were to ask, is Newton going to get a promotion because of this? Like,
Yeah.
I don't know. Like I think if what I do acts in service of the organization getting done what it needs to get done,
Mm-hmm.
like that's the bottom line. And so I think of it as like, so back to that book, The Status Game, it talks about like there's various ways to accrue status. One is you build up credibility playing by the rules of the game within the machine that you're in.
Mm-hmm.
Another way is it's kind of a flex to differentiate yourself and say, I'm not going to play by the rules because I'm going to take a risk. And that may work out great for you. It may not. So that's one risk. And then two, you can't really do that at scale or it's not differentiation. So it's kind of like the early adopters of the new behavior. Like that might work for them in buying them more status in the system. over time, it has to become the norm, and that differentiation is not going to work anymore.
Mhm.
And so I don't know how to cross that bridge.
Hey, Drew, we got to pay for this podcast somehow. Why should people sign up for Long and Strong?
Guys, if you like the things that we talk about on Mops and Mo's, specifically some of the things we dive into with our 101 episodes and how we think you should train, Long and Strong is the place to see that play out in real life. Long and Strong is our ongoing team training program. We use the Train Heroic platform to deliver training. No subscription is required, so you can hop on and hop off whenever you'd like. If you want to get started, if you want to give the first week a free trial, head over to our website, mops, the letter N, mo's.com. You'll see the training tab right there in the middle. Click that, follow along, and sign up today.
And now back to the episode.
So you said you don't know how to cross that bridge, but the question that comes to mind is I want to ask about a bridge you have figured out how to cross that I'm a little bit jealous of, which is like in the space you're operating in.
Is it sumo deadlift? I'm very good
It
at
is not
deadlift.
sumo deadlift. Sorry, we can talk
I
about that
do
later
have
if you want.
questions on that later. I'm just going to make a note.
But
Keep going.
like something I run into all the time is that like having conversations about nuanced issues around health and performance and wellness and things like that is really hard to engage people on. Like as soon as you introduce like nuance, things fall apart. It's easy to engage people with like inflammatory statements or like one-offs or whatever it is. But when you break into like real nuanced conversations, it gets a lot more challenging to hold people's attention and keep them engaged. And I see the mental health space full of the classic, like it's okay to not be okay. Mental health is health, self-care, all these things. But you've seemed to have successfully broken through that and into a space where you're successfully having nuanced conversations around managing life stressors without throwing out like a quote everybody's heard 1,000 times, or like acknowledging where you're succeeding and where you're struggling and things like that. Like how did you get to the space where you're able to keep people engaged while having legitimately nuanced conversations?
The whole thing is it has to start with the authentic, vulnerable story that resonates. So it's like, what did 20-year-old Newton need to hear? Let me use an analogy because I think health and performance, it's relevant to all of us enough that and impactful to the day to day that you'd say like, well, of course you should care about this. Like just try a little harder so that you stay engaged with the nuance. But let's say instead the topic was doing your taxes and are like, wait, I can save you another 5%, but you're going to have to learn about, exceptions and this new policy. Like, just stay with it. It'll be worth it. Or like, no, you've already lost your audience. So the process instead would be something like me telling a really kind of embarrassing story that's highly relatable about how I fucked up my taxes. And that's the hook. And are like, yep, I fucked it up, and I never frame it as I have figured out this secret and let me share it with you.
Oh God,
It
thank
is
you.
always, yeah, it is always, this is what I went through. I really fucked up, and here's what works for me now. And so I always frame it that way because I never want to position myself as the expert, because now it's kind of like you've separated yourself from the audience. It's like I want to stay in it with you because I truly am. And then from there, I kind of start with like the most, let's say I do a 3-point list. I start with like the easiest to engage, where I'm like, I know this will speak most directly to you. And then from there, I can go deeper, and I can do that two ways. One, I can get either the more nuanced stuff, or I can go more philosophical. But I always start with like, okay, I need to make sure you read the story. The story will get you to read point number one. If point number one is good, you will read point number two. It's basically like an old copywriting technique, or I forget what they call it. It's the something slide, where you're like, I need to make a slippery slope. So you just slide your way through the entire post. And if I get enough dwell time on this post, then Instagram will serve this reel up to more people, and I will get more likes, and they will also go down the slide, and so on and so forth. And then you end up with 1 million plays.
I think a way, I know I'm guilty of screwing this one up because, and this actually ties back. You introduced us to Charles Vogel, who we had on the podcast recently. Fantastic conversation there. And it didn't actually come up during the conversation. It came up with my initial phone call with Charles, where we were just chatting about what we might do on the podcast. But he brought up, and I'm probably going to get the terminology wrong here. I think he called it like the curse of the guru or something like that, where as you go farther and farther down a rabbit hole of finding all these things that are interesting and nuanced to you, you want to talk about those things, but to engage people, you're going to have to meet them where they are, which is always at the same place. They're always at the entry point to the rabbit hole, and you always have to like go back there and meet them where they are. And I think I'm often guilty of wanting to focus on like the thing that I find cool in the moment rather than realizing that that's not what people are looking for in the moment they are in. And it's a challenging thing to keep those balanced.
Totally. So I think back to like the way you were framing my Instagram following and my content categories. One big one, it's around career.
Mm-hmm.
Like I never sought out to be a career coach. I did not want to advise people on things like what major should you pick. But if I think about where my audience is, like those are the stressful things they're facing right now. And if I'm like, okay, my goal is for us to be able to be more open about our struggles so that like whether it's the struggle today or the struggle tomorrow, whether that's job, family, children, etc., you're going to be able to talk about it and get the help and support that you need. Then like fine, let's talk about picking a major, which was my reel today. I'm like, yeah, I have a story about fucking that up. So let me share it with you. Let me share you a few things I learned, and see how that goes. And so it's both. On the one hand, there is kind of a dissatisfying feeling to it. I'd rather talk about other things. Sometimes I worry that I'm pandering, but at the same time, I have to stay focused on, well, what am I trying to do here? Like I'm trying to reach people so we can have these conversations. And if engagement is part of that, then I need to be able to do the things needed to engage people, or else there's no conversation to be had whatsoever.
Okay, fine. I'll take the bait. What do you think is the best college major?
Ooh. So let's see. I did electrical engineering, and so
Yeah.
there's a few things that like I just don't have enough exposure to, but I do think like engineering thinking as well as the underlying skills, like I'm not an engineer, is crazy valuable.
Hmm.
It was like from a few standpoints. I went to get my MBA and I'm looking at the coursework and I'm like, you serious? This is like yeah, I can do this in my sleep. So you get hardened to the point where you can zoom through any other coursework, except for more engineering work because that stays very hard. And then engineering thinking, like you are just trained to focus on facts and look at things, say, mathematically if possible. This does create blind spots, but for things that are not people issues, it creates so much clarity and both speed and clarity of thought and analysis. And that has served me so well throughout pretty much every job I've had.
So as you're saying that, so Alex, what was your major?
International relations.
Right. And my major was business. My minor is in African studies, which I've used 0 times. And then you were
I had a minor in terrorism studies.
Yeah, but now here we are talking about human performance. It's interesting because I've mentioned this to a lot of people who have reached out to me. I was on the phone last week actually with I think a student that had reached out to me on LinkedIn asking that question, and I tell them like exercise science, like sure, do that as a graduate degree, like specialize there, great. But I think we all of us seem to have leveraged something totally unrelated to human performance in the human performance space, which I think is interesting.
Well, actually, one question to just challenge what I threw out there, because I think engineering thinking has been super valuable, but one of the points that I made in my Instagram reel was one, it taught me a way of thinking, but then two, it made me confident that I could learn new ways of thinking, which I absolutely had to do. If you had to think about a major that made you most effective at learning new ways of thinking, I don't necessarily think that would be engineering. And in theory, that would get you higher leverage over time.
I think there's a balance you have to find. It was my mom who first explained to me that like undergraduate degrees are for learning how to learn. They're not for like specializing in something. But I think there's a balance where you need something that's going to get you hired after graduation. Like that does matter, and you can't ignore that. Because I mean, if we go down that rabbit hole, like the end state of it is like the ultimate choice is like philosophy, right? And I know people with undergraduate philosophy degrees who are doing really great things in like high power companies and are super successful. But I also know people with philosophy degrees who moved in with their parents because they couldn't get a job after their undergraduate. So like it might give you an awesome set of tools, but it doesn't necessarily get you a foot in the door. And that's like the balance you're trying to figure out with undergrad is. And this is a classic opportunity to do some pro bono military recruiting. No matter what you get your
Oh
undergraduate
God.
degree in, if you are contracted to join the military afterwards, you are guaranteed to have a job and you can think about whatever you want in undergrad.
That's actually
There,
that's a pretty good sell.
there we go.
Hey, I did not worry about getting a first
What
job.
comes to mind, I mean, to answer that question, and I say this somewhat biased because I mean, I did a degree in business and specialized in entrepreneurship. But I mean, you talk about something that makes you think different things. Like marketing and sales comes to mind because you have to figure out how to navigate different environments. I say that I don't particularly like marketing and sales, but isn't there a book called like Everything is Sales or something? I feel like that's a thing. Like you're always be selling or something.
It's definitely a saying, and I actually totally buy into it.
Yeah. See, maybe that's the answer. Maybe we solved it. Maybe we solved your Instagram post. A marketing degree. Okay, but let me ask you. Okay, let me ask you a question. Because I mean, illustrious powerlifting background. Have you found that the pursuit of mental health for you has changed your opinion on what truly matters when it comes to getting bigger, faster, stronger? And we can cage that by just calling it human performance. But have you found that there might be something more than just the things we obsess over, which seem to be reps and sets?
Yes, and I need to spend more time with the post-its that I never move around, but thinking about what is the interaction of the two. So if I boil it down to something really simple, it's like we know that an athlete's level of engagement with the program you give them is going to affect the outcomes pretty dramatically. Now, if I say, well, what affects engagement? You can now end up with this portal to like all the things non-physical, or some things physical as well. It's like, well, you know, where is this person, mentally, emotionally, spiritually? And at some point, like you could say, no, I don't want to bring those things into the conversation because I don't know how to handle them. With my coaches, I've actually just they don't necessarily know how to handle them, but I'm treating it as more data is better, and I have no qualms about telling you these things. So I tell them like, well, training went this way. I think that was affected by I was struggling with depression last week. I'm doing these things to get my mental health into a better state, and then let's see how next week goes. One of my coaches, he's older and been on his own journey, and I think he has we can go back and forth and bounce ideas about things I could try. One of my coaches, he's younger and maybe less experienced in terms of life, and he also defines his remit as like I'm about nutrition, and if I stretch that a little bit, we'll go to supplements. So he'll go as far as say like, well, let's make sure you're well fed during this stressful time, and maybe try some ashwagandha. I fully acknowledge I am out of my element here. So he gets the issue there. But so actually here, let me give an example of I think a better conversation around mental health that if I peered in the future and said there's no stigma around mental health, how might a conversation with your team or your coach go that now enables you to better engage with your health and performance program? A few weeks ago, I was struggling with depression enough that I was concerned it was like I was showing up at work in a less productive way. So I get to my team meeting and I say, okay, I just want to acknowledge I've been struggling with depression for the last few weeks, and I'm not sure if you see it, but I felt like if I should walk the walk and I should be open about that. Now, the next thing that happened was a bunch of heart emojis appear on the screen. And I'm like, okay, wait. I actually cut it off. I'm like, no, don't do that. That was not the intent. That I very much appreciate it. That's not what I want right now. Instead, here's what I need you to do. Um, I will have to slow down in some areas, but I do not want to be holding up the work. So if you need something from me, what I want you to do is ask very directly and specifically, and I will get it to you as quickly as possible. If that's still not quick enough, send me a chat message and I'll prioritize it. So I just turned it to straight tactical.
Hmm.
And so what I did there was like I didn't mask what was going on with me, which just kind of reinforces people masking their struggles. But I still got to the tactical of, and the work doesn't stop. So if you'd be willing, can you adjust your style of working with me in this way? Some way or someday, I don't see why we wouldn't all be able to do that and why that wouldn't be more productive.
Hmm.
So you have me thinking, like the back and forth between you and Drew there. And it kind of brings me back to where I connected with you originally and what our original conversations were about of like, what can the military learn from corporate wellness? What can corporate wellness learn from the military? And like, I don't know what's on your sticky notes, but it sounds like it's related to some of this stuff. But the like when I started in the human performance space, it was with the Army. And in the Army, it's obvious what the point of physical fitness is. Like you need to be able to perform physically for your job. Done. Easy. And I have since transitioned into a role that's still with the military, but the people I serve are much more focused on technical tasks that aren't inherently or obviously physical. And I think that's where I start to see more of the overlap with some of the things you talk about and the space you work in is that like to be a successful employee at Google, you don't need a certain deadlift or a certain 2 mile time, but there's still a relationship between your ability to show up at work and your ability to manage stress and your ability to perform cognitively and how you take care of yourself physically. It doesn't have to be reps and sets of powerlifting. That just happens to be what you like to do. But there's still this like connection between the physical and the rest of health and wellness. And I I realize as I'm talking that I don't have a question mark at the end of this, but I'm just kind of wondering what that looks like for Google Health and Performance.
Um, it's interesting. We struggled with that same question before, and we would just kind of talk broadly. We were very conscious of not prescribing any one way for people. What the mental health conversation has done that I think is actually maybe helped the conversation, even though like many are struggling, is it kind of gives you a singular entry point into the larger discussion of well-being, where it's like, hey, like I have this theory that if you designed a whole health and well-being program that says we're just optimizing for mental health, like I think you would get all the upside benefits across the board because you would have to consider physical fitness, spirituality, social health, emotions, the way you manage your thoughts. But you now have it just anchored in one thing. And so as mental health has become like a bigger struggle across society, and more of, say, our health promotion campaigns use mental health as a starting point, I have the hypothesis that we'll get further than we did by showing people the full spectrum in every aspect of health and well-being and asking, how would you like to engage?
So that raises a question for me because the way I've like articulated this to other people and like framed it in my mind is that the military is very focused on the physical. It's easy to see, it's easy to quantify, it's easy to set standards on all these things. And as a result, for us, the physical domain tends to be, I've called it superficial before, but really it's the gateway into the other domains. If someone starts to struggle with or fails a fitness test, or their weight is above what it can be for their height or whatever it is, that's a great way to realize that there's something underlying going on. In an environment where you can't tell people they have to pass a certain fitness test or have a certain body mass index or whatever it is, where is your access point? How do you find out people are struggling in the environment you're in?
Hmm. A lot of the time we don't until, say, someone raises their hand and uses the services are private, but when someone goes to engage with, say, the employee assistance provider,
Mhm.
or they do something like they need to go on mental health leave, and that's the equivalent of, in the physical domain of like an injured athlete or an injured soldier. It's like not where you want to get to. Now, upstream, it can be really, really hard to tell. And so I'll give a very like Asian American specific example. This was kind of an aha for me from this book uh, was reading called Where I Belong. And it's about how mental health struggles manifest with Asian Americans. And so normally what you'd look for if someone is struggling with mental health, you'd see things like, oh, I've stopped performing at work. I'm just not showing up. Sometimes I've let my hygiene go. And then it said, except if you're from some Asian American cultures where you would never let that happen because your mom would appear out of the woodwork, somehow from 100 miles away and like scream at you. Not that my mom would scream at me, but the shame is internalized. So, so I would never let that happen. But so then it says, and this is the part where I'm like, I'm really struggling to get my head around the implications for a company that hires, like a tech company that hires a large Asian American population that is generally very high performing. It said the way that things like depression and anxiety will manifest or mental health issues are perfectionism, people pleasing, overachievement, overwork. So I look at that and I say, wait a minute. So the manifestations of mental health with certain Asian American populations are also the same things that lead to high performance and lead to rewards for those characteristics and behaviors. So if I design a system which rewards high performance, which it should, I'm also at risk of potentially
Mhm.
rewarding the symptoms of mental health struggles with high performers. So this is where I'm like, okay, this is going to be completely masked, and the system may incentivize the mental health struggles itself. This is why now I'm walking around these corporate environments loudly telling my stories of depression and anxiety. Because if no one shows up different, then there's nothing to model off of to represent a different way of us showing up. So that was my other aha is like, wait, if we're asking leaders to show up in a different way, but we don't learn from reading a doc or a sheet of tips and tricks. We learn from modeling and watching other leaders. And if we're at a point where the stigma keeps leaders from showing up in a different way, there's nothing to model off of. So I don't know that I know the one right way, but I think, a better way. So I'm just going to keep showing up, doing things differently, and telling my story. And hopefully over time, some will follow.
I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head right there in terms of the earlier question we were asking or sort of bouncing around, which is like high performance organization like Google, high performance organization like the Army. Because again, I think about just what I see in my world, modeling behaviors by leaders. Like oftentimes it's the leader who's the last person to leave the building, and you have all of the people that work for him or her sort of twiddling their thumbs, waiting to leave because they haven't modeled the thing that they've been preaching on and on about, which is work-life balance, et cetera, et cetera. So that's really interesting. And I don't know how you do solve for that, because to your point, it's like you want the high performance, but the high performance is kind of a symptom of the bigger issue. And if you take one away, the whole thing kind of crumbles. Again, I don't know if there's even a question at the end of that, but I think it's a really important point that's worth repeating, which is like it seems like a very, very delicate and dangerous double-edged sword.
Yeah, so actually, can I call back to one of your previous episodes that I just listened to that kind of blew my mind?
Please.
The combatives episode.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, I can't remember your guest's name.
Matt Larson.
Mhm.
Yeah. I really liked his comments on, well, if you want combatives to actually be part of the military in the way it should be, like, what are all the things that would have to change? And, he talked across, like the things that are, um, that are measured, the things that are taught and how they're taught, and then the things that are celebrated. And so that it gave me a lot of thoughts of like, okay, for a current system, let's say in a company, the things that are celebrated are performance that leads to revenue, for example. That's an oversimplification, but um, I think it's largely correct. The thing that I'm watching for is like, okay, mathematically, we may hit a tipping point where, on the one hand, you produce revenue. On the other hand, you now have, let's call it a leaky bucket problem, where if within your organization you have a certain rate of mental health struggle, as well as people doing things like going on leave or leaving the organization, then I'm like, well, you own that problem too, and that costs you money, and it's probably hurting your ability to produce revenue. So you can keep just plowing through the top line, but what about this issue? Like, how are you going to resolve that? And so at some point, I'm not hoping, but I'm theorizing this might not mathematically work out anymore. And we're going to have reckoning of what's a different way of us working so that it's not just a machine that burns people out. Not to say every company is that, but many companies, that's the situation right now.
Well, and as you're saying that, I mean, you're speaking about it through the auspices of revenue and dollars, but I mean, retention for the military, the same issue. It's like, on the one hand, everyone's wondering like, why can't we retain? Why can't we recruit? Why aren't people joining? On the other hand, a quick glance at any military meme page on Instagram will give you all of the answers in terms of what is truly pissing people off in this organization. And it's just that there's this, I think that, and it's weird to say this as a civilian, but like this lack of truly valuing the human element and accounting for some of the things that you've been speaking about. Again, not necessarily dollars and cents, but I do agree with you that there's probably a reckoning at some point of like, here's what it truly costs you as an organization to value people and have them feel supported. And it's probably higher than you want it to be. And you're going to have to cut somewhere else. I want to ask you though, because I know we're working towards kind of the end here, and you've mentioned a topic a couple of times, and you don't need to dive super deep into it, but practically, I'm curious about this mental health leave and what that looks like, because I could see that being something, and I don't want to sound crass, but like I could see that being something that gets abused in some sense by people. But I also see a really big value in it as an option. Like you mentioned, an athlete gets injured, they sit out for a while, they heal, they come back stronger. I'm curious at an organization like Google, and with your experience, what mental health leave actually looks like.
Yeah, so I'll say for an organization like a Google or other organizations where they can hire like really, really talented, driven people, my my hypothesis, and I don't have data on this, is that I would suspect we don't have a problem of people abusing the system because they came there fundamentally because they are extremely driven. And so the downside of going on mental health leave is you take yourself out of your career. It's like you take the athlete off the field,
Hmm.
the one who really wanted to get the starting position and win the championship. Like that is catastrophic to them.
Mm-hmm.
So that is more what I see when I talk to people who are considering mental health leave. They're not like, I just need a break, I want to get out of here. It's overwhelming fear of what will this do to my career. So that makes certain assumptions, like every organization's population is different, but at a company like within the technology industry, that's more often what I see by a long shot.
Hmm.
What was your other question?
I'm just curious because I mean, I always contextualize these things into my world being the military, and this idea of mental health leave as a concept, as a, I guess, a lever you could pull if you needed it, and just kind of what for you the implications were, are, how you conceptualize it, how you think about it.
Yeah, so for me, when I decided to go on mental health leave, there was a lot of fear of what will this do to my career? And the breaking point for me was that the question I was more afraid of is what will this do to my family and my relationship with them if I don't go on mental health leave?
Hmm.
And so a lot of people, they'll say, "Oh, you were so courageous to do that." And I kind of reframe it. I'm like, actually, I was driven by fear before the mental health leave. I was driven by fear into the mental health leave. And it doesn't feel great to say, but um, it's good to know that I'm wired that way when faced with some of these big changes. And it gives me some insight into like what does get me to change at times. As I went on to mental health leave, so just having the space, it took my brain like a full 2 weeks to just ramp down. And so at that point, I thought, I'll just do some breathing exercises, clear my head. There's a whole cacophony of anxious thoughts and white noise going on. And after 2 weeks, it finally diminished. And honestly, I couldn't remember a time in life when that hadn't been there, like maybe when I was a kid.
Hmm.
And once that was gone, there are some like quieter thoughts that seem more intentional, that feel more natively you. And so once those appeared, I'm like, oh crap, like that Newton has been in there under that noise all that time, and I could not hear him at all. At that point, I went and reconnected with friends from my past, like who knew me in, say, my teens or my 20s, because I really wanted to reconnect with, like, okay, like who was I in the past before all the resume building? Um, from there, like now I was in a much better place over time, and I had to consider what was my reentry going to be. I don't know if I did this intentionally, but I really need to check my motives. Um, I was given the opportunity to tell my story. And so I frame it as like, it was fortuitous. I had the opportunity to tell my story, and then I did, and then I committed to keep doing it because I knew how many were struggling. I have this suspicion that there's also part of me that said, I need to control my narrative, and I got to turn this into a hero story. And this is an option to do that. So you know what? I'm not coming back, crawling back in. I'm coming back guns blazing in a way that makes sense for me and for the narrative of I went on mental health leave. And both can be true. It's like I was trying to do the right thing, and two, like pats on the back for doing the right thing are pretty nice. So I like those too.
So, like you said, we're trying to work it towards a close here, but you made me think of two valuable things that I'll breeze past before I hit you with a hopefully rapid fire closer, but you'll probably have a super insightful answer for it. One, I just want to say personal experience recently with the value of reconnecting with friends from the past. Um, I hadn't like lost contact with these guys by any means, but it had been like several months at least, maybe more than a year for one of them that I hadn't heard from. Just got two calls from friends I went to high school with, like out of the blue. They just called. I happened to be available. We chatted for a while, and the mental health value of that, where it's somebody who knew the previous you rather than the current you, and they're not particularly like worked up about what you're doing at work or anything like that. They're just chatting. There's I would People talk with like veteran mental health stuff all the time, but like take some time and like call a buddy that you haven't been in touch with in a while. Massively valuable. So shout out to Kyle and Colin for calling me the last couple of weeks. And then you talked about like the Google environment and how you're like less worried about people abusing a system like that. And it made me think of something I hear from a lot of coaches in the strength and conditioning space, but I think this probably applies equally in work environments is like especially in group environments, you start to recognize as a coach, some athletes need giddy up. They need you to like push them to go harder. And some athletes need WOA. They need you to like slow them down because they're going to go harder than they can sustain on their own. It sounds like Google is full of, we'll say athletes, but employees that need you to hold them back a little bit. Whereas different organizations may have to take a more individualized approach to recognizing who needs to pull back on the reins, who needs to get pushed faster. And there's a challenge to navigating that in any organization. After all that rambling, go ahead. I see you ready to talk.
Yeah, I would say like the model of, whether it's a Google, a Meta, an Amazon, it's try to get the most talented, driven people you can that fit the culture. And then we all act surprised when we're like, oh, why are we all running at 3,000 miles per hour and driving each other insane? Like, well, that's exactly the system we designed.
So, speaking of the system you designed, you're in a super high performance, cutting edge organization. What actually is the cool, modern, new way that Google is handling mental health for its employees? What are the actual mechanisms in place to try and tackle this in an organization like that? Or is it just that hard?
I've seen the nap pods. We talked about the nap pods before.
I won't speak specifically for a Google because I don't think I'm supposed to.
Fair. It's fair.
On this topic.
Hey, me neither. Alex as well. So you're amongst friends.
But I'll talk about where I'm personally inspired, and I work for Google. I have these conversations with other companies, and this is the direction I feel like it needs to go. So there's all the Google 1.0 or whatever we want to call it, or Tech 1.0. We were known for the beanbag chairs, the massage chairs, the free food, like the gyms, and all that stuff is really great. But clearly, if you look at mental health rates, whether they're inside in high performing tech companies, like looking at that cohort, or the general population, all that stuff clearly doesn't necessarily insulate you from mental health struggle. And so as I've talked with more and more people about their mental health, yes, we start by talking about depression and anxiety. Where we always end up is talking about what are the things that are obstructing me from living the life that I want to live. And so it goes back to, I think, a bigger societal, cultural conversation around things like, our social disconnection. Are you guys familiar with the term workism?
No.
I've heard of it. I couldn't define it for you.
Okay, there's I can't remember the name of the book it's from, but the author, their thesis is that we have designed a culture where we worship at the altar of work.
Yeah, I have heard that.
Yeah, and if you look at the way that we valorize people in our society, like, yeah, there's some validity to that.
I'm so busy.
So yes, exactly. So if you look at like social disconnection, the workism culture, as well as like the various pressures we're having in society right now, whether it's economic, younger people trying to buy a house, for example, political divide. So people are asking like, well, I'd like to move here, the numbers work out, but politically I don't think it works out. There's all of these complexities coming together that are really making it hard for various people to build the life that they want to live. And struggling enough in that society and maintaining that dissonance, like it is, I'm not citing research here because I have not done a study, but it doesn't seem like that a big a leap to say, yeah, I might end up kind of depressed about that or quite anxious because I can't make life look the way I need it to or the way I want it to for me and my family.
It's heavy.
Well, yeah. And I mean, now I'm not going to let myself keep going. We're going to put a bow on this. We're going to put a bookmark in to have you come on a fourth time, because now you're getting me into all this different cultural stuff. And I have an affinity for like the Scandinavian work culture and blah, 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 blah. Anyway, thank you again.
What if we do an episode where it's like, here's all the nuanced stuff we want to talk about that we think will drive the audience away?
That's fine. I'm totally down to do that. The episode no one wants to listen to,
All
presented
right.
by Alex and Drew. Oh man. Well, hey, thanks again for coming on. Thanks for taking another hour out of your life to talk to us. It's
Happy to do it.
always a pleasure.
Yeah, always a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
For sure.
As usual, having Newton on the podcast, we ended it by saying we're going to have Newton back on the podcast.
I think we can just admit that he's probably a frequent flyer, which is fine. Newton's episodes are always fun because we don't seem to plan them out as much anymore. And I mean that in a good way, because I think both of us, it just is easy to start talking. And even with this episode, we were just talking, and then okay, now it's becoming an episode. We've talked about this, I suppose, privately, but we might as well put it out. Like, I really want to dive down some of the rabbit holes around the mental health thing and sort of the workplace, because I think there's some interesting conversations to be had there. And if any senior leaders in the military are listening, maybe like we could have frank conversations about how to actually fix some of that stuff.
I think it's tough too, though. So, two things. One, I just saw research today about how when it comes to some of these mental health, employee well-being, family well-being, all these things, uh, programs at like a local level tend to do better than programs established top down from the top of the structure.
Well, Charles Vogel said as much.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think, yes, we definitely want to talk to some senior leaders about this and have those conversations. And if anybody knows a good senior leader to come on and have that conversation with, please, we'd love to do it. But at the same time, I wonder how much control do senior leaders really have on the mental health outcomes of people much farther down in the structure, right? Like I think when I was a lieutenant, I don't think my like anybody with stars on their shoulders had a whole lot of influence over my experiences down there. I think like captains and majors and lieutenant colonels and sergeants first class and first sergeants and sergeant majors did. And so I think, yes, senior leaders play a big role in this, but I think realistically, like mid-grade operational level leaders might have a bigger role in this.
No, I don't disagree. But what I think when I go to the senior leader point, what I'm thinking more like, because I agree, programs are best done at kind of the grassroots level. I think we established that with talking with Charles Vogel, and it comes up all the time talking with Newton. But I think it's the people at the highest level that can influence organizationally and institutionally and culturally what happens. And I kind of always go back to like COVID. And I look at, I mean, I was with a different branch of the military during COVID, but you could probably apply this to just about everywhere. We saw that organizations can still run when you sort of loosen the leash on people. And I think that there are some, I can't name them right now, but I'm sure there are some institutions out there that have recognized that and adjusted the way that they define work-life balance, work from home, like all these different things. But it's interesting because you also see a lot of organizations, and I'll put the military in this, that just completely walked all that back and was like, okay, COVID's done. Boom. You guys are back to what we were doing before. It's like, well, wait a second. We seem to work okay when Private Snuffy was given a little bit more time at home. Like, I wonder if the things that we think of as super critical are as critical as we think that they are. So that's kind of the senior leader point. But the other thing that really stood out to me, 2 points that stood out to me talking with Newton. Number one, he mentioned this. We didn't really dive down to talk about it any deeper, but when I think about human performance, probably for both of us, the physical piece is what sort of is like in the front of the line, and then everything else trickles down from that. And he brought up a point that was interesting, which was that what if we flip that, and what if the mental piece becomes the primary, and then everything else kind of trickles down from that? I don't know what that would look like. I mean, we'd have to sort of thought experiment that a little bit, but we've always thought of the gym as kind of the gateway to the mental health, and the athletic trainer and the dietitian and all the things like it comes from the gym. But I'm wondering if you could somehow switch that around and change that. Because then the other thought I had as he was talking about that is like, what if you just did away with this domain terminology entirely? And I know that's what kind of holistic is getting at is, but even in casual conversation with people, it seems that everything gets partitioned into its domain. So much so that then the athlete on the receiving end of all these services starts to think of themselves as being partitioned into all of these different domains. And it's like, well, physically, I'm fine. I don't have any injuries. Spiritually, I'm okay. Mentally, I'm screwed. It's like, well, but that also just means like from a zero sum perspective, like you as a person have something going on. And I don't know. I don't, that's like an incomplete thought, but those were the two things that stood out to me talking about it.
Absolutely. And I think so, like, what you're bringing up ties back to several episodes we've done previously. He referenced one of them in the conversation with Matt Larson, but a lot of it has to do with incentives. I think you can, and this is like I wouldn't call this like a hot take. It's just not like a useful statement, but I think it's pretty true, which is that you can really figure out what an organization's priorities are based on what they incentivize. And he talked a lot about the incentive structure around the bottom line, or if it's the military, it's an incentive structure around not revenue, readiness and OERs. But
That's where I think the senior leader part comes into play.
that's fair. And I think figuring out how to have a conversation around that is tough. But I think the even bigger problem there is this goes back to Hammond's law. I don't like giving you free compliments, but
It's okay. We
the
can
whole
pretend it's a
thing,
different Hammond.
yeah, we a lot of what we incentivize are just the things we found that were easiest to measure that get us closer to our goal, not the things that actually get us closer to our goal.
Mm-hmm.
And like mental health is really hard to measure. It is. I don't know.
I know, but I just get the sense that we're getting closer to a mass reckoning. Like he even used the word reckoning of like it may be the most important thing. Which I don't know what you do with that. I don't know. You and I are not going to solve that issue, but it makes me want to talk to more people about it. So,
Sounds like we've got some future episodes to plan.
boom. All right. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you guys next week. Bye.
Hey, Alex, let's cover our ass real quick.
Oh, great idea, Drew. All right, guys. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent.
Thanks for tuning into this week's episode. Before you go, please rate and review the pod on the listening platform of your choice. You can also visit us on our website at www.mopsinmos.com. That's mops, the letter N, mos.com. You can check out the library of podcast episodes, our latest blog entries, any helpful resources, and also sign up for our newsletter.
Drew nailed it. Just to underline a couple of things, the podcast entries have in-depth show notes on the website. So if you missed anything or you want to read any of the research we talk about, it is all there. You can, at the bottom of the website, sign up with your email and receive future updates from us. The blog posts go a little bit more in depth in kind of written form on a couple of topics we get questions about all the time. But most importantly, I just want to ask all you guys, our best way the word gets out is absolutely word of mouth. So tell your friends, tell the people you work with, anybody you think would find it useful. Thanks for spreading the word.
If you have any questions or comments, feel free to shoot us an email at either Drew or Alex at mopsinmos.com.
Or there's a contact form on the website.